Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this week's video I'm going to make a confession, and that is that I'm a snob. A camera snob to be precise, and you might be one too. But the reason I'm a camera snob is because I only shoot in manual. And the reason I only shoot in manual is because if you use any of the other modes on a camera, you're a cheat and you don't know what you're doing. So are you like me? Is that the only mode you use? And you lord it up amongst your friends because they use aperture priority, shutter priority, or heaven forbid auto mode? Well, we're going to look specifically at one of those today, because between you and I, ever since I switched to using aperture priority mode, my photography has went to the next level, and yours can too. Because in aperture priority, you can do things a lot quicker, and in changing light, that is absolutely essential. Because if you look at the moment, the sun, which is glaring at the moment, will be gone in about 20 minutes. So between now and then, the lighting is going to change quite significantly. And that is where aperture priority really does shine. So what is aperture priority mode? Well, it's one of the semi-automatic modes on your camera, and it's designed to do one thing very specifically, and that is to make sure that the priority when taking a shot is what you select as your aperture. Now, the aperture is one of those dials or one of those settings that has a real effect over the creativity of your shot. If you want to have a really wide open aperture, then you're going to get a really shallow depth of field and you can blur out the backgrounds and the foregrounds. Or if you're doing more traditional landscape photography, then you can close the aperture down to f8, f12, f whatever it may be, and then you get a much greater depth of field, and that gives you a pin sharp image from the front to back. Now, I'm a landscape photographer, and for the last 2 or 3 years I've been using full auto mode, which means I'm responsible for selecting the aperture, selecting the ISO, and also selecting the shutter speed. Now, you can imagine, although landscapes don't tend to move that fast, sometimes you're just blessed with a bird flying across the scene, or on days where it's a little bit more windy, some of the leaves start to move, so you need to change the shutter speed, and by changing the shutter speed, then the light getting into your camera changes, so you might need to put up the ISO, and before you know it, you're changing 3 settings. But with aperture priority, and another tip that I'll give you later on in the video, so stick around for that, you only need to change 1. And I was very sceptical about using this at the start, but over the last couple of weeks I've been trying it out to make sure that when I make this video, I'm not giving you information that I don't believe in. It has absolutely transformed, not necessarily all my photographs, but it's transformed the way that I take photographs, how creative I'm getting, how many more unique angles I'm trying to get, because I know that I can get low with one hand and that the camera's going to take care of all the settings, and all I need to do is pick the focus point and take the shot. So going back to the start of the video, I said I was a snob, and I actually do mean that, because to me, when I first started photography, I kind of felt that if I used anything other than full auto mode, I was cheating and cutting corners, and that my images wouldn't be as good. What actually has transpired over the past 3 years of using full auto mode is I've had more than my fair share of soft images, underexposed images, overexposed images, because I'm trying to do the whole thing myself, and I'm trying to do it on the fly. And again, as I said earlier, with the changing light conditions, that can be quite tricky. There are a couple of things that you need to think about when you set this up for the first time, and it's going to make it so much easier for you to capture a correctly exposed image. So let's look a little bit more closely at what it actually does. As the name suggests, you as a photographer choose the aperture. That's the only decision that you need to make. And once you've selected your aperture, the camera will work out what the best exposure is for that, and it will either slow down or speed up your shutter speed to let less or more light in to balance the aperture that you've selected. And with the cameras on the market these days being so intelligent, why wouldn't you trust your camera to do it? You trust it to do a lot of other things for you that you might not even know. But that said, there are times where the camera has its limitations. For example, if you choose an aperture of f11, the sun's going down and it's starting to get a little bit dark, and you're hand holding your camera, the camera may choose a shutter speed that is too slow for you to comfortably hand hold. So what do? Well, you would bump your ISO up as you would normally do in any of your modes. So you can start to crank up the ISO, and again, with cameras being so technologically advanced just now, you shouldn't be scared about introducing noise into your photograph. So if you're using software like Topaz or Lightroom, you can denoise your image after the fact if it needs it. With the images that I'm about to show you just now, these were all taken last night while I was out using the camera, and I only added the smallest amount of denoise to the images once I get back to the studio. But in all honesty, I didn't need to. It was just me pixel peeping, coming right into the image and saying, that's got a little bit of noise in it. I guarantee if you were looking at it on a wall, on your phone, on your PC, without zooming in, you would never have noticed. So in essence, that's what aperture priority is. You choose the creative element of your aperture, the camera works out the shutter speed, and if it's too dark, you use your ISO to control your exposure. But ISO isn't the only way to brighten your image if you find your shutter speed's too slow, because when you're in aperture priority mode, you can use what's called exposure compensation, and that can be a real lifesaver. But David, I'm not really comfortable with the camera making all those choices. What if it decides to go down to such a slow shutter speed that I get blur in my photographs? Okay, so I've talked about exposure compensation and bumping your ISO, but there's a far more important thing you need to do. And you do that before you go out. In the settings, you can choose what the slowest shutter speed will be, and the camera won't go below that. So for example, you may choose that the slowest shutter speed you want is 1/120, and the camera won't go below that. Your image may get too dark at that point because it can't go slower to let in enough light. And that's when you start to use exposure compensation. Now I know this can be quite a tricky thing to explain, but I'll show you how I've set my camera up. I'll show you the back of the camera and how you can choose what the slow shutter speed you'd be comfortable with is. But as I'm making this video right now, I realised that the sun has just went behind a cloud and that the exposure has changed dramatically. So if I was shooting in manual, I would need to adjust all 3 settings. But as I'm doing just now with my Osmo Pocket 3, it's choosing it automatically for me. And this is kind of the same thing that's going to happen with aperture priority mode. You choose your aperture and let the camera do its job. You paid enough money for it after all. So as I said, there are times when you might not want to use aperture priority because it might be that you're looking for a slow shutter to make a waterfall look more dramatic, or you might be doing nighttime photography where you need to focus on a star, let in as much light as you can, which sometimes can be an exposure of 1, 2, 3 seconds. And again, aperture priority really isn't the mode for that. In those situations, then I would revert to using full manual. So being able to use full manual mode is not a hindrance, but it's definitely not what you should reach for 8 times out of 10. So are you still a snob? Because if you are, let me tell you that the vast majority of professionals are using aperture priority mode most of the time. And the reason for that is because again, they don't want to miss the shot. If you set your settings for a reasonably fast shutter speed as your minimum, you know you're not going to get camera shake or blur from it being too slow. And if you can control the exposure using the exposure compensation setting, then you know it's never going to be too dark. One of the added benefits I've found since I have started using aperture priority mode, and this is really one of the things that has transformed my photos, is that I have a tendency to see images dark. You'll see some of my photographs, I'll put them up on screen just now. I love a dark, moody shot. And what I tend to do is, because that is my chosen aesthetic, when I set up my camera to take a photograph, I tend to lean on the dark side. So to give you an example of how this speeds you up when you're out in the field, imagine this. You've got a lovely sunset happening behind you, you're taking photographs pointed directly into the sun, and then all of a sudden something happens over there behind you. So you turn your camera around and the magic happens. The shutter speed slows down to let more light in. It won't go below the limit that you've already selected in your settings, and you don't have to touch a single dial. It will work it out for you. It's truly magic. But David, what if the camera turns round into the dark place and I need to start thinking about boosting my ISO? Well, that brings me to my final and most important tip that I talked about right at the very start. This is where we introduce auto ISO into the equation. So we can actually let the camera choose which ISO setting is the most apt for that scene. Now I can almost hear everybody screaming because you're thinking 128,000 ISO, an absolute noisy mess. But as you can do with the shutter speed, you can choose the limits for your ISO settings. So if you're not comfortable setting an ISO above 6400, then you set that as the upper limit. And when the camera does its thing, it takes into account the slow shutter speed you've picked and also the maximum ISO that you've picked, and it won't go above or below them. And that is how you protect your image from shake, from blur, and from noise. And just remember, if you choose to use this mode, you're not cheating, you're not a beginner, because most of the professionals are using this most of the time, and for very good reason. It makes the job easier, it keeps you focused on what you're trying to take photographs of, and it makes sure that the outcome and the product of your night's walk along the beach is as good as it can be. The camera can definitely make a mistake, but trust me, it makes a lot less mistakes than I do, because it's not rushing about. It doesn't realise that a deer or a fox or an eagle has appeared in the scene and you've actually panicked. So it will make the decisions based on your settings, and it will return an even exposure for you most of the time. So are you convinced? If you haven't tried it, I would urge you to at least try it, because it's an absolute joy to be focused on the scenery instead of the dials. Ever since I started using Aperture, ever since I started using it, my photography has went through that sun. Oh, sorry, I've fucked that up. So what is Aperture Priority? I can't even say it, never mind use it, which means I'm responsible for, I can't say that. Okay, so whilst that's a bit, it funnily enough controls how important shutters, Jesus. So let's talk more specifically about what Aperture Priority does. The camera may choose such a slow, there is a denoiser, and I haven't denoised, I denoised all of them. But there is an easier way to do this, and instead of using ISO, we have what's called our something. What's it called? Jim, what's that thing called? Exposure compensation, Jim. Well done, have a banana. Oh yeah. Oh, the midges are out. I'm talking utter pish. I'll see you in the next one, guys. Thanks for watching.